I'm going to do a Bible reading now. We are continuing our series in 1 Timothy. We'll be doing it for a while. We've started this year. We're aiming to finish this year, but things sometimes blow out. And it's interdispersed with other things as well. But this morning we're back to 1 Timothy, chapter 5, verses 1 to 16. So I'll read that out, and then later in the service, Matt will be up talking us through this. Do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as if he were your father. Treat younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters, with absolute purity. Give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, these should learn first of all to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family, and so repaying their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing to God. The widow who is really in need and left all alone puts her hope in God and continues night and day to pray and ask God for help. But the widow who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives. Give the people these instructions so that no one may be open to blame. Anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. No widow may be put on the list of widows unless she's over 60, has been faithful to her husband, and is well known for her good deeds, such as bringing up children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of the Lord's people, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds. As for the younger widows, do not put them on such a list, for when their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ, they want to marry. Thus they bring judgment on themselves because they have broken their first pledge. Besides, they get into the habit of being idle and going about from house to house. And not only do they become idlers, but also busybodies who talk nonsense, saying things they ought not to. So I counsel younger widows to marry, to have children, to manage their homes, and to give the enemy no opportunity for slander. Some have in fact already turned away to follow Satan. If any woman who is a believer has widows in her care, she should continue to help them and not let the church be burdened with them, so that the church can help those widows who are really in need.
Good morning, everyone. And once again, let me extend a very warm welcome to you. It's great to have you as part of our Sunday morning service, regardless of whether it's your first time or maybe for some of you your 500th time. It's great to have you with us. My name is Matt. I'm one of the leaders here at MCC, and I'm continuing, as Louis said, our relatively long-running series through the letter of 1 Timothy. Believe it or not, this is I think the bulk of chapter 5, and there's only 6 chapters in 1 Timothy, so I'm pretty confident we'll get it done by the end of the year. 1 Timothy, yeah, but you know. 1 Timothy is a letter written by Paul. Paul was one of the early church fathers, if you like. He was a leader of the early church and an author of much of the New Testament. And he's addressing this letter, he's penned it to one of his proteges, a younger man called Timothy. And Timothy was the senior leader of a church in Ephesus. Ephesus you can now find in modern-day Turkey. Back then at the time of writing, it was a large, bustling, cosmopolitan city in the Roman Empire. So that's a bit of the context. If you want more context, again, please dive into our YouTube channel and catch up via the videos there of the sermons that we've done on this wonderful little letter. But let me start properly by asking you this. Do you ever run the risk of putting people into boxes and then treating them based on those boxes or categories that you've put them in? Is that a risk that you ever run in life? Now, as you're probably aware, there's many traps that come with being a leader. There's many traps that come with being a church leader. And one of them classically is putting people into boxes. And it's probably a risk that actually increases with both time and experience. Because this ability to put, if you like, people into boxes, to categorize people, to recognize patterns, to some degree, it comes with its strengths as well. My jiu-jitsu coach has been coaching for about 15 years, and he's like got this almost superpower where he can pretty much accurately predict within 2 weeks of someone coming into the gym. He can predict whether they're going to hang around for the long term or bail after a couple of months, because there's very little that he hasn't seen in that context. I've got friends who work in the mental health space, and they're responsible for performing one-on-one, if you like, diagnosing and then administering interventions to people around their mental health. And again, they can pick patterns because they've been doing it for so long. And that's kind of useful because they can see these patterns in advance and they save time. So there's a strength to that. There's pros to it. But of course, there's also risks and downsides too. And again, church leaders, any leader, I'd say, our risk is that we box people usually into kind of, one of two broad categories. So it's either this person is an asset that can be deployed in the service of the organisation that I'm helping lead, or this person is a squeaky wheel that is going to suck time and energy. That's the risk. And part of that risk is that we lose sight of each other's God-given individuality and uniqueness. And again, we can so easily just resort to treating people according to the box or category that we put them in. That's one risk. Or on the other side, we say, look, I so desperately want to avoid that risk and that extreme that I'm going to try to treat everyone exactly the same all the time in the name of fairness and impartiality, and ignore their real world, and I'd say God-given age and stage and maybe even gender. Does that make sense? There's two kind of extremes I think that you can kind of go to. You can either box people or you kind of pretend that we're all the same, there's really no kind of meaningful differences between us, so we treat each other as blank slates. I think this passage, 1 Timothy 5, verses 1 to 16, is a reminder that on the one hand, we shouldn't be boxing or categorising people mindlessly. We can't ignore their individuality. But on the other hand, we just can't blank slate them either and ignore the fact that age, stage, and gender play a role in both how people experience the world and also how we interact with them. So let me show you. Please, if you've got your Bibles with you, crack them open. We're looking at 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 1 to 16. I'm going to have pretty much the entire passage coming up on the screen as well. I'm not going to bother reading it out verbatim this morning for the sake of time, so please just follow along in your Bibles or on the screen. At the start, in the first two verses, you'll see that Paul gives instructions to Timothy on how he, as a senior church leader, and presumably others, should interact with 4 different groups of people within the church. Really interestingly, look at the metaphor, like the primary metaphor that Paul uses across all 4 groups there. It's family. It's fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters. It's that familial. We'll come back to this later. But then, while there's all that similarity in terms of the overall metaphor, look at the differences that he asked Timothy to note. So there's different social dynamics and different risks associated with, say, interacting with older men compared to younger men, let alone older women and younger women. For the older men, Paul asks Timothy, he instructs him to literally, and this is a literal rendition of the words, not give them a verbal pounding. Timothy, don't give the older men in the church a verbal pounding. Now, we don't know why this was a risk, but perhaps the older guys were looking down on Timothy due to his younger age. Maybe they thought they knew better how to lead a church. Maybe they were stuck in nostalgia and sentimentality for the good old days when the church at Ephesus was really rocking. Maybe they were kind of resisting change. Regardless, Paul says, don't give them a severe verbal pounding. Don't rebuke them harshly. But what's really interesting is that Paul doesn't write, don't rebuke them full stop. Timothy wasn't meant to equate age with wisdom. Just because older guys are more experienced doesn't mean that they are above being lovingly and respectfully asked to pull their heads in occasionally. It's true, right? I mean, that's the implication. But even then, and this again is so important, despite there being a kind of older guy category, look what Paul asked Timothy to do instead of the severe verbal pounding. He says, exhort them, exhort these older men as if they were your father. So let me ask you as a quick little thought experiment. Picture your father for me. Again, picture your father dead or alive. Try to recall how he personally would have felt exhorted, that is, inspired, encouraged. What would that look like for him? What would you have to say or do for him to feel encouraged or inspired? Hold that. Now take either your partner's father or your best friend's father. Run them through the same exercise in your head. I bet there'd be significant points of difference between the two, and you'd only know what those meaningful details are after knowing both those fathers personally as individuals. Does that make sense? Yeah? Paul is not saying treat all older guys this way, as if they're the same. No. He's saying that as a group, they are meant to be treated with a particular emphasis that is different from other groups. So age, stage, and gender matters. But they're still to be seen and loved as individuals, because you can't effectively rebuke or exhort other people impersonally. You follow me here? You need to know someone to do either of those things really effectively. That's the older guys. Then there's the younger guys. Paul writes to Timothy, treat them like brothers. That is, as peers, as equals. So when a young guy, and this is a stereotype I know from church, when a young guy comes to you and is full of zeal, is full of idealism and energy and passion for following Jesus and getting on with church-related stuff and changing the world, what you don't do is slip into that kind of cliched older guy, slightly condescending and skeptical role, where you're a little bit world-weary and you inadvertently dampen the classic enthusiasm of younger guys who think they can change the world for Jesus. Paul says, Timothy, don't be like that. Don't be like a kind of condescending, patronising older brother. And then, Timothy, again, a younger man, is asked to treat women, both younger and older, as family. But you'll see there in the text that in the case of the younger women, an extra qualification is given. Paul says, treat younger women, Timothy, with absolute purity. That is, be modest and chaste in both word and deed. And again, I'd argue this is Paul acknowledging the reality of creation and culture and not treating everyone exactly the same. And church history, unfortunately, bears witness to the reality of this. The younger pastor isn't usually having an affair with an older woman. That is not the cliche in church circles. Now, Paul could have stopped there and just stuck with viewing all older women as being in the same box. But look where he goes to next. From verse 3 onwards. He introduces a subset of predominantly, but not exclusively, older women. And that is widows. He starts talking about widows. Do we still hear much about widows in our culture? I don't think so, and that's a good thing, because I think thankfully it's a sign that society has changed to a large degree, as in our society, our context has changed, and widows are no longer as vulnerable and exposed as they were in biblical times, where along with orphans, aliens, sojourners, and the poor, God made special provision for them in his laws, and also in the example of Jesus in the Gospels. Because these groups, those four, were often on the very fringes of society. So there's clearly a special place, if you like, in God's heart for vulnerable groups who society generally turns their backs on, like widows back in the day. But even then, Paul isn't willing to just box them in with a label. There are widows, and then, as we read in verse 3, there are widows who are really in need. So, as we read, those who have adult kids or grandkids in the church should first and foremostly be supported by those adult kids and grandkids. And this is like another example of actions, of our behaviours being really important when it comes to our spirituality. Paul writes, in at least some translations, put your religion into practice by doing this. Put your religion into practice. So like Mike talked about last week, do you want to train for godliness? Paul says in this letter, it's super important. Train for godliness. Here's an excellent start. Look after your family. Look after your family. And interestingly, Paul appeals to something like natural law here, the kind of morality that was obvious to everyone, not just Christians. Looking after your parents or your grandparents was only paying them back, if you like, for the care which presumably, if you made it this far to adulthood, you'd receive from them. It would have been obvious, probably like gone without saying at the time, that if you don't look after your parents or your grandparents, then who's going to back then? Is it going to be like the state, all those yet to be created NGOs, those community organisations that weren't in place yet? Of course, there was no one else. It was up to the family. So just imagine like a new small sect trying to establish itself, and people from the outside are looking into this religion, this new religion, and saying, look, these guys can't even get it together to look after their own. That would have undermined the credibility of both the church and, by extension, the message of Jesus. But most importantly, we read in verse 4 that this behaviour of looking after your elderly family members, it pleases God. It's showing people the same love that he showed towards us. To neglect looking after your own family is displeasing to God. In fact, if you look at verse 8, Paul makes this explicit. Anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Just catch the implication there. It's really important. Have they denied the faith because of some doctrine or creed that they did or didn't sign off on? No. Was it something that they did or didn't say? No. It's a sin of omission, if you like. It's not even doing the wrong thing here that is the issue. It's more not doing the right thing, regardless of what you say you think, believe, or feel. Paul says the issue here is what we don't do. Does that make sense? Really important. So, sure, widows as a group are not nearly as vulnerable in our context as they were at the time, and that's a good thing. But I'd argue two, if you like, timeless principles still stand out. Firstly, God still has a heart for groups that are on the outside of affluent society, for those who are on the margins, who don't access the same material resources that people like me can. That's the first thing. And secondly, as followers of Jesus, God wants us to care for our elderly family. It's an integral part of our practicing our faith. In a way, it's owed to our parents and grandparents, given what they've done, admittedly in differing degrees for us, but most of all, we're called to care for our elderly family because it pleases God. That's easy to say. One thing that's crucial to add here, just because we should do it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy, and in some cases, it doesn't even mean that it's going to be possible. I get that. And we'll come back to this later. But going back to Paul, and Paul going beyond just boxing people into general categories, you'll see in verses 5 to 6, he starts to even distinguish between different kinds of widows. He seems to be arguing that some widows are entitled to what he calls proper recognition. That is, the church is responsible for providing for them. And then there's this other group of widows over here who are living for pleasure, which can also be translated as just being completely self-indulgent. Now, the second group of self-indulgent widows, these presumably are not entitled to that proper recognition that the first group are. But here's an important thing. That's not the same thing as saying that the church can't ever care for them or offer assistance. Paul is not prohibiting these second class of self-indulgent widows ever being given aid. It's not that. But he's distinguishing that from a right to proper recognition. So these shouldn't be read as complete prohibitive blanket statements. But just pulling back a bit, like, doesn't this seem to be a big call to you for someone to make? It really struck me. Like, Paul is saying to Timothy, listen, as a church leader and as a church by extension, you are making a distinction between widows who deserve recognition and those who don't because they're self-indulgent. It's hard not to kind of take that personally, right? Like, it's hard not to take that personally. It's a pretty personal call. How do church leaders make that call? Now, I don't know the details, obviously, but the one thing I think we can be certain about is that to make that kind of call, which is personal, which is there's no escaping it, it is like there's a moral judgment there, it required knowing people as individual persons. Again, not just as categories, right? To make the hard decisions about who deserves recognition and who doesn't, that can only be done properly in the context of a personal relationship. Seeing the individual and not just the box or the category of widow. Does that make sense? I think like that's just built in, right? Some commentators think that Paul then went on to make even further distinctions. So verse 9, if you read that, mentions a list or a register of widows. Now later on in church history, believe it or not, there was like an order of widows that emerged. So these are recognised ministries made up of widows who did good deeds. Probably weren't in existence at the time of writing of this letter, but that could have been the early genesis of that, like a list, a register, if you like, of widows who made some kind of formal commitment to ministering for the church and were supported as a result. And Paul, in this passage, gives a list of behaviours that they needed to kind of exemplify. Now, this list probably wasn't exhaustive, and I'm not suggesting it was hard and fast, but it still points to a certain kind of life that was characterised by these kind of behaviours. So, over 60, because at that time and in that culture, if you married at the age of over 60, it was highly unlikely. So it was, if you made it to 60, chances are you were going to be celibate for the remainder of your life. You had to be a one-woman man when you had been married. You had to have demonstrated interest in the upbringing and the welfare of children, not necessarily your own. You had to be hospitable. You had to have a track record of serving other Christians in both good times and bad. Now, the argument for this kind of way of life, requiring some kind of formal commitment, is that there's just so much tied up in that list that even reading it makes me tired. There's an entire ministry that requires a level of recognised dedication, right? So Paul is maybe recognising that there's a type of widow who's demonstrated this kind of lifestyle and will now continue in a focused fashion to minister in this way and will be materially supported by the church. A paid ministry. Does that make sense? That's one interpretation of this kind of confusing passage. This kind of calling requires commitment. And so Paul then goes on to write that it won't suit younger widows. Why? You'll see here. And look, I get it. Hearing Louis read this out before, it's hard not to listen to this passage and go, man, Paul is so judgy. Why is Paul being so judgy? He's like, don't put them on a list. They should just get married, pump out the kids, knuckle down, endure domestic bliss. That's how it can almost sound like, right? But I want to suggest Paul is showing some wisdom here in the context of trying to lead and trying to give Timothy guidance on how to lead a whole community of people. So he's taking into account the typical drives, desires, the priorities that go with people's ages and stages. He doesn't want young women making pledges to getting involved in some highly demanding ministry that involves being single and then having to pull the plug on it because they understandably fall in love and want to remarry, which is, again, much more likely to occur if they're under 60 in that culture. Paul's smart. He knows that perhaps the risks that come with youth and inexperience and too much free time are things like busybodying, speculation, and in church circles, often gossiping with a religious veneer. Look, we're not gossiping here, we're just sharing prayer points, okay? That's all we're doing. We're not really gossiping, right? He knows that if that kind of reputation gets out to the broader community, it will compromise the church reputation and standing. So let's remember, Paul was trying to help Timothy lead a group of people in the everyday trenches of real life. He was generalizing for a community, not making absolute statements that every young widow was going to be a busybody and a gossip. Does that make sense? I'll take that as a yes. So let's bring this all together, right? Let's bring this all together. People are prone to treat other groups in either the same way, that is as blank slates, so you're all the same, so a kind of uniformity, or people can put people in boxes and then treat people relatively disparagingly. Younger people these days, what do you do? Okay, boomer, all that kind of stuff. In doing so, the risk is that we lose sight of the individuals that God has created and placed us amongst. We depersonalize people to the point that we don't feel very much affection for them at all. But here's the thing, right? When you become a follower of Jesus, you also become part of a spiritual family. And being part of that family comes with both having something in common as well as a purpose. This isn't an accident. Look at Paul's words in Ephesians chapter 2:19. Consequently, you were no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household. Household also meaning family. Family. So look, we are not a group of strangers here. You are not a group of strangers just thrown into a room by accident. You've got the most important thing in common if you're a follower of Jesus. You're part of a household. You're part of a family. And the crucial thing is that you can trust your good, loving, and powerful Father to put you in the right family. In fact, we know God puts people together in new relationships with and for a purpose. And these relationships require seeing each other as individuals. Look at this. Jesus is dying. He's on the cross. And in John's biography of his life, we have the account where as he's dying, he looks to his disciple John and his own mother standing at the foot of the cross. And he's recorded as saying, "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, that is John, "Here is your mother." From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. Church community, ideally, should help strangers feel like family and bring people into closer relationships that actually help form them into the individuals Jesus wants us to be. I.e., we can't be the people, I can't be the most Christ-like version of myself without the people that God has called me into spiritual fellowship with. Does that make sense? I need you guys to become the individual God is calling me to be, and I think that's reciprocated. Okay, so to close, some suggestions as to what to do with all of this. First of all, let's check our thinking and beliefs. One of the things I find liberating about this passage is that it gives examples of how you can be both served by the church and offer service to those in the church, regardless of age. So these older widows who are on the list exemplify the truth that you can both be supported, you can be a recipient of aid, of charity, call it what you will, but you can also at the same time be someone who serves and supports others. And this is from 60 well onwards. So it's not a case, it's not as simple as a case of someone either being the beneficiary of good works or the provider of them. God, in his love and his creativity, allows you to be both. And I'd say, that's got to be good news for you, particularly if you're older and feel like you're only a dependent on others. Now, sure, there may be extreme circumstances right near the end of life, but up to then, I'd argue God can use you to meaningfully contribute to others, even when you're being supported by others in some way. And I'd argue there is a dignity and a vitality, it's actually youth enhancing, something that goes along with that. So you don't just have to see yourself as a dependent person, a recipient of ministry. No, you can still serve. Secondly, check your conscience. Have you been putting people into boxes? Like I said at the start of this talk, it's easy and human enough, but we want to be mindful of that and don't resort to that unless the situation actually calls for it and it's helpful. So are you young and boxing all older people as weird, out of touch with reality and entitled? Are you older and boxing all younger people as weird, out of touch with reality and entitled? And at the same time, we should be trying to take into account what is likely going on with other people due to their age and stage. I've been having more and more conversations recently with people around the difference in financial standing that seems to be generally increasing. You can be an older person who's on the brink of retirement or maybe having had retired and you've paid off your own house, and it's so easy to forget that for many younger people coming up, that is a dream that seems almost impossible to reach these days. And that stuff matters when we actually interact with each other. Are you looking after any elderly or dependent family? And like I said before, this can be difficult already, and perhaps in our culture, it's becoming harder. More and more people are at least talking about, if not experiencing, what they call family estrangement. Adults cutting off all contact with immediate family by choice. One study out of America recently, it was like a proper legit study, reported, and again it's American, but it'd be similar over here, 26% of young adults are estranged from their fathers, 6% from their mothers. That's 26% of young adults reported being estranged from their father and 6% from their mothers, again by choice. A finding suggesting a societal shift away from traditional bonds of family. Look, I know some of you have experienced this and have lost contact with your children. And I expect, sadly, it'll happen to more of us. There's lots of debate as to why it's happening. It's not simple in terms of its cause. But please, let's take this as a church family, as an encouragement to do what we can to be a counterculture to the way society seems to be going in this regard. And regarding our affections, let's try to look on older and younger people as we would a relative that we would feel something for. And to do this, I'd suggest, don't just try to manifest warm feelings or fuzzies for them. Instead, start by initiating some real-life contact with them. So this week, as an idea, maybe even right after the service, why not get to know someone just a little bit better? Proactively talk to someone who perhaps you wouldn't normally engage with, who you know very little about. Try to make it meaningful. Have a conversation around what sparks joy for them. What do they get righteously angry about? What's something that they perhaps regret in life? Just an idea. But finally, if you're not a Christian with us this morning, or perhaps you're on the fence, here's what I'm inviting you to enter into. The world that we get a glimpse of, I'd say, in this passage is complex. And with that comes difficulties. It's acknowledging the reality of age, stage, and gender when it comes to social dynamics. Looking after your elderly relatives is tough. Having to make tough calls that sound like distinguishing between deserving and undeserving widows, that's also really tough. But please hear me. Cutting through all of this, to have that kind of complicated dynamic in a social group, all that necessitates a community where you are known and you truly know others. So this is an invitation to what I see is life in 3D. So it's not just hanging out with people who are like you. It's not just hanging out with a group that you've kind of curated by choice. And it's not just having fun with other people, but kind of keeping them at a distance so it doesn't get too personal. This is perhaps a church community is the best place to experience glorious, messy, heartbreaking, heart-enlarging, true community. And to Mike's point from last week, the best training ground for growing in godliness. So if you're at all interested in finding out more about that, please come and see me afterwards. But let me pray. Father, I thank you that this church community is not an accident. I thank you that, again, in your power and your wisdom and your love and in your ability to work with some meaningful scope of free will on our part, you've put us together. Father, help us love each other. Help us be motivated out of love and appreciation for you, I pray. And help us be the kind of community that doesn't deny or turn our backs on the complexities, but again, works through that with your help and the help of each other, motivated by your spirit and love in such a way that brings you glory in the eyes of a watching world. Amen.